Ms. Furstenau, a very good morning to you.
Good morning to you too.
So yesterday in the legislature, you spoke about the overdose crisis, and that dominated a lot of the discussion and a lot of the back and forth. You raised the issue in the legislature yesterday, and what's your response to the Premier's suggestion about that the provincial government is not getting a favorable response from the federal government?
Well, my response to that really is that the provincial health officer in 2019 actually laid out how BC could take a leadership role in terms of decriminalization of small amounts of drugs for personal use. And I think that given that we are now losing 6 British Columbians every day to a very toxic drug supply, the urgency of action needs to be there. And for the Premier to say, well, we just can't get the federal government to do what we want it to do. Okay, if that's not working, then what can we do right here in British Columbia to prevent this terrible loss of life that's happening?
There have been suggestions in the past, how the COVID-19 situation was dealt with by making it a nonpartisan issue right in the beginning. And a lot of the steps were taken by all the parties in conjunction with each other, in cooperation with each other. There has been suggestions to make the addictions issue a nonpartisan issue. What's the progress on that? Because it seems like the government is not too keen on proceeding along that route.
Yeah, in fact, our party, the Green Caucus, as well as the BC Liberal Caucus, we both sent letters to the Premier and to the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions indicating our willingness and to work together on this issue, because when we see a public health emergency like the overdose crisis, we need to set aside all partisanship and recognize that we need to come together to protect British Columbians. In fact, we need that on many fronts. We have a lot of overlapping emergencies in British Columbia right now. And the best way that we can approach these in this legislature is to work across party lines and to work together on them.
Ms. Furstenau, the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions, I mean, it's not an easy ministry to handle with the crisis that we have, but how would you evaluate the performance of the ministry over the last 4 years since it's been created?
Well, as you point out, it's a very difficult crisis. But what I have failed to see, or what the ministry isn't doing, is responding with the same level of urgency that the crisis requires. And so year over year, we are seeing more and more people being harmed and dying from an increasingly toxic drug supply. And when we have experts, researchers, healthcare professionals, advocates, all indicating the same thing, which is start with harm reduction, ensure there's a regulated, safe supply so that people can stop dying. That's the first step. And then move, of course, towards providing treatment, providing support, trauma-informed treatment. The vast majority of people really need to have access to trauma-informed mental health care and supports. And recognizing that this is not an issue that is disconnected from so many other issues. And we have to stop looking at things in silos. People need housing. They need access to mental health care. They need we need to look at systemic racism and the role that that's playing in these outcomes. And so it's a very complicated issue, but the uncomplicated thing is that 6 people every day are dying in this province.
I also want to talk to you about the climate issues and the other pressing issues facing the province. Now, the government announced a 5-year plan last week to move away from fossil fuels. What's your response to that $260 million proposal?
You know, I think you can really measure the priority of anybody, but certainly of a government in where they choose to put money. So $260 million to move forward with some policies to reduce carbon emissions is one thing, but consider the $1.3 billion that goes in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry every year. And so a quarter of what is being given to the fossil fuel industry, or even a fifth, is being put into reducing emissions. Until we are serious about a real transformation, which is what we need in response to climate change, we are going to continue to see what we've seen in British Columbia for the last several years, which is an increase in our emissions. Mm-hmm. And this government is trying to focus on discrete policies as a response to the greatest and most systemic issue that we face, which is climate change. And when you look at the letter that was signed on by over 200 individuals and organizations last week, mm-hmm. they lay out very clearly what's needed. It is transformational change that we need. Leave nobody behind, protect and restore nature, invest in transforming our communities so that we have zero carbon transportation, zero emissions buildings, invest in regenerative agriculture, and importantly, wind down fossil fuel production and use and stop subsidizing the oil and gas industry. Mm-hmm.
Do you think we are not talking enough about consumption management? Because this $260 million, as you say, I mean, it is a mm-hmm. drop in the bucket if we look at the crisis at hand. Now, a lot of it is going to go towards electrification, chargers here, chargers there, and some money for other initiatives. But how come the governments are not willing to talk about, to give the message to people about consumption management? Because mm-hmm. a lot of the carbon footprint is emerging from overconsumption.
Yeah, sorry, the bells are going off here in the legislature. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I'll just wait for the bell.
Yeah.
There we go. You're absolutely right that we are not going to buy or consume our way out of the climate crisis. And we need to reorient so much of how we live and how we exist. And what we can see from leaders on climate action is that when we transform our communities to be more human-friendly, to be more open and connected, we actually discover that it is the connection in our community and to each other that really nourishes us. The notion that we can all just buy an electric vehicle is really out of line with the reality for so many people mm-hmm. Who can't even imagine affording a new vehicle. And that's why we have to invest in accessible, affordable transportation, invest in communities that have walkable and bike rideable areas. But importantly, invest in a future that really puts well-being for humans and nature at the center of our efforts. And when we do that, we will find not only that we're addressing the climate crisis, but that we're addressing the social crisis that we're also facing, that lack of connection and lack of cohesion in too many of our communities.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Furstenau, yesterday there were some protesters protesting against the old growth mm-hmm. logging right outside the legislature, and those protests have been going on for a long time in the Fairy Creek area. What should the provincial government do at this stage to show leadership on this file, now that the government, the courts have mm-hmm. also sided with the protesters and with the ruling that came out recently? What does the government need to do?
Yeah, in the decision from Justice Thompson, it was very clear that he was putting this entirely at the feet of the provincial government. As we've been saying from the beginning, this is about forest policy, and this is a government that ran in an election a year ago promising to mm-hmm. protect old growth forests. And the expectation from the public is that they would live up to that promise. That's what they have to do now. And again, it is going to take a transformation of how we do forestry. But if you consider that forestry policy today is based on very outdated science and knowledge about forest ecosystems, was produced before we were really understanding and grappling with climate change, we need to orient forest policy around protection of biodiversity, the capacity to absorb carbon emissions, and the recognition that our forests are an essential part of the services we need to do well: water, security, clean air, and that these ancient forests are some of the last ecosystems on this planet that exist in British Columbia, and that this government promised to protect them, and we need to see them act on that promise now.
Also, Ms. Furstenau, I quickly want to talk to you about the Site C dam as well. BC Hydro submitted a project report to the BC Utilities Commission last week. The money spent on this project, when this was initially envisioned, it was said that the whole project could be completed in about $8 billion. And that amount of money has already been spent up until this point. And right now, the budget looks at about $16 billion for this project. Now, given that, we're talking about clean energy, and the government stance is that this project will provide a lot of that clean energy that is much sought after. Why is this still such a big problem, apart from the extra money that this project is going to take?
Well, there's a number of problems with this. One is the ability to produce clean energy should be looked at as a way of not being as destructive. This dam is going to be enormously destructive to agricultural land and to biodiversity in the Northeast. And at a time when we should be really focusing on food security, the notion that we are eradicating a massive volume of some of the best agricultural land in our province makes no sense. The cost of this dam and the cost of the electricity that will be produced from it is enormous, and ultimately it will be BC Hydro ratepayers that have to face that cost. And if we look to Newfoundland and Labrador and Muskrat Falls Dam, the federal government has had to bail out because of those costs. We can see how this is going to play out. The costs will continue to rise. The impacts are enormous. At the time that the BC NDP approved going forward with Site C, there was a wind project lined up for Tumbler Ridge, which would have produced 70% of the electricity that is going to be produced by Site C, with a minimal impact to the environment, and it would have been up and running already. And so this is not about the ability to produce clean energy. We can do that in much less damaging ways. This is bad decision making. This is the illogical approach of the sunk cost fallacy. And I'm afraid that we are going to continue to see what we've seen all along with this dam, which is the costs will rise, the problems will continue to present themselves, and the impacts to the lands and the ecosystem up in the Northeast is devastating.
Ms. Furstenau, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too.